This is Sirens, a not so new but still awesome series brought to you by the ladies at Bombshell, where we dissect the institutions of American power. Join us as we sound the alarm on technology, governance, and national security issues, and almost certainly lure some men to their deaths. I'm Loren DeYoung-Schulman.
I'm Radha Iyengar-Plump.
And we are here today. We will have a special guest later in our episode with Rebecca Lissner at the Council on Foreign Relations to talk about AI politics in the U.S. But we've got plenty of issues to cover up front, starting with a very important and dramatic one, which is, what is the worst icebreaker you have ever had to do at work?
So mine is it comes from the pandemic era. And it was, I had two small children, including a 6-month-old baby. And we went around and did this icebreaker that was like, what new hobby have you taken up during the pandemic? And I was like, my hobby is not causing harm to myself or my family while I work full time and have no childcare, which is not really the right answer to a light, funny experience, but was definitely my lived experience in the moment. And I just thought, hey, man, maybe don't bring this up as the way to intro this conversation.
I loved, in the pandemic, I felt like virtual meetings opened this strange window into people suddenly becoming very dark and emotional at work. I remember being in a couple of conversations where, things that would never happen in person, suddenly, virtually, people were like, oh, well, yeah. And then these 17 terrible things happen. And you're like, wow, okay, all right. And then I remember another meeting that was meant to be like a fundraising pitch where I was pitching another organization. The other organization just went down this deep, dark path of the toxic work environment they worked in. And I'm like, guys, I have never met you. But mine, similarly, was during the pandemic, but it was more in the absurdist phase where we were asked, what is your favorite potato salad, kind of potato salad? And here's the thing, when you do an icebreaker and everyone has to go around the room and say their answer, you are usually compelled to say something different than the person before you in some way, which meant that you couldn't just say vinegar potato salad or mayonnaise potato salad. You have to be potato salad, and here's my grandmother's 79-page recipe associated with it, and a sweet story from my childhood. So it literally took us 30 minutes to get through the potato salad icebreaker. So word of the wise, unless you're trying to take up time, do not do the potato salad icebreaker. But Rod, I love your honesty here in the, this is the life that I meant. Okay, well, we've got lots and lots of things to walk through in It's a Drill. I only have one topic this week because my other topic stopped being a topic, which I guess should call a success. Similar to my preview from the last It's a Drill we had, I can now say affirmatively the Department of Homeland Security, with some exceptions, is shut down, which means that unlike prior shutdowns, most workers, 90% of workers, are still on the job. It's probably 90-ish. OMB would be mad at me for making such a bold statement. Most workers are still on the job, but not getting paid because we have apparently totally forgotten the whole accepted, not accepted versions of whether or not people are getting paid or not. All the lawyers at OMB must be losing their minds. In addition to that, ICE and CBP were fully funded through the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, but TSA agents, as an example, are at work without paychecks. What this raises for me is a number of things. The fact that there is basically, as far as I can tell, no immediate fix that's coming. The Congress has gone home for a couple of weeks, or at least the House has gone home for a couple of weeks. They have no plans to do anything about this. So it's kind of a question of how long this administration is willing to allow certain parts of DHS to go not being paid for what's that going to mean? And I'm reminded of the last shutdown where they started doing all kinds of weird stuff with pulling money from different accounts. So I would expect things like that to occur as well. But the final point I'll make here is I just love that the demands that the Democrats are putting forward here are things like follow the U.S. Constitution, and that is out of the question. We cannot follow the U.S. Constitution in terms of their ability to cut this budget deal. So anyway, DHL shut down. We'll see how long that lasts.
Wow. Well, I guess people don't really need paychecks? No, that doesn't sound right.
Nope. No, that doesn't sound right at all. Particularly the people who are looking at your bags and security stuff while you go through the airport. I'm sure they really, really enjoy working full time without getting paid.
Yeah. Okay. Well, mine is in a, I don't know, slightly different vein. I had two. One was this review slash, I don't know, threats to defense primes that started with an executive order from President Trump in late January that froze these stock buybacks and dividends for defense contractors until they, quote, deliver on time and on budget, which I'll confess I have some sympathy for. But they were, we're talking about something like $8 billion annually in shareholder payouts for like the top 5 primes. So you can see where the Trump administration is coming from. But they followed this up with this pretty strong statements from the Army secretary on warning contractors on their right to cancel contracts and to adapt or risk replacement. And essentially, the strong words from the Army secretary de facto accusing the industrial base of having conned the Pentagon into believing that the military needed specific military solutions when they could just buy commercial alternatives and save a lot of money. And so he did things like bring helicopter parts on stage, showing a specific screen knob that cost $60 to a $47,000 screen knob that costs like $60 if you want to 3D print it. And essentially, and by essentially, I mean quite literally accusing defense primes of price gouging. Now, this is part of a pretty forward-leaning, I'll call it, approach from the Trump administration to push commercial, more off-the-shelf technology, get it faster and quicker, which of course has some benefits, but also has come with some risks in terms of performance and reliability of the systems, like things exploding in service members' hands at experiments and training sessions and so forth. So I think that the open question here is whether with threats and intimidation, they can get like Lockheed Martin and Northrop to operate like, I don't know, SpaceX or Anduril, and whether these kind of programs are, whether the disruption you generate in this industrial base is going to unlock innovation or create a lot of turmoil that actually further impedes delivery on key systems in the middle of a big race. So, time will tell.
I likewise have some, maybe not quite sympathy, but like intrigued sympathy for this policy exercise, while also being quite frustrated that one of the big challenges in federal procurement is that procurement officers, contract officers, simply don't have the time, space, capacity, or expertise to actually oversee the contracts that they are in charge of. And in fact, we've outsourced a whole lot of those roles to integrators. Whereas at the Department of Defense, like, while that is still a problem, it is not the same problem it is that, say, at the Department of the Interior. So some of my sympathy goes down when I think about some of the challenges that are that should not be challenges within our massive defense ecosystem. Anyway, Radha, what else should we know about gossipy cocktail party topics?
So I told Loren, I really wanted to talk about the election in Japan for 2 reasons. One, the PM, who's the first woman prime minister of Japan, Takaichi. I'm sorry if I'm saying that terribly wrong.
When we talked about her before, I did the same thing. I have absolutely no idea. The prime minister.
She's like 3 months in, and she basically put her job on the line with the promise to resign if she didn't win a majority. And if you're wondering, Lauren, if she won a majority, the answer is she won a supermajority because she's a super.
Whoa.
So it was the largest single party majority in Japan's post World War II history. They gained 118 seats, and the voter turnout was like 57%, which was higher than it is usually. And she personally worked the message, worked social media, worked with young voters, and basically drove these sort of viral moments, got praise from Trump, had a drum session with the South Korean president, like just was awesome. And the second reason to talk about this is it allows me to talk about how I have the same purse as her. And my husband for Christmas sourced the purse of the Japanese prime minister that is amazing. And now I too look forward to calling snap elections and or wielding my power for viral drum circle moments that will result in the stock market jumping like 5% because that's what she did.
If you know Radha's husband, you should compliment him on this because he needs the praise in order to reinforce the system here that we've created. All right, we have one definite dumpster fire, and then also, I guess Munich is sort of a dumpster fire, before we get on to our interview with Dr. Lissner. So, Radha, I will turn it over to you so we can talk about my favorite topic, scheduled PC.
Yeah. So, on February 5th, the Office of Personnel and Management finalized a rule that is one of the most sweeping changes to the federal civil service in over 140 years. It's called the Schedule Policy/Career, or Schedule PC, and it essentially converts 50,000 federal positions from the competitive service to at-will employment, which more or less means that it changes the job protections for the core civil society expert, which basically means it converts the job protections for our core government employees to allow them to be fired more easily by changes in political leadership. So it's a lot of nerd jargon, and we wanted to break down for you both what it means and why it's important for us. So Loren, maybe you could talk through a little bit about the rule, which is not taking effect through until March 8th, but is widely opposed by opposition. Like, what is it? Walk us through some of the basics.
Mm-hmm. Right. So folks will remember this originally branded as Schedule F in the first Trump administration. We'll talk about in a minute how it's still a little bit different. But this, what we're talking about now, was a rulemaking process that started at OPM last year. So President Trump kicked off an executive order saying we're going to do this again, told OPM, go generate a rule through the regulatory process, and which means they design a policy, they get public feedback on that policy, they get agency feedback on it, they get public feedback on it, they update it, they have to respond to all the comments that they get, not all of them literally, but like all of them by category, and then come up with like what the new rule is. So that a 94% of all comments were opposed to the rule. So that kind of seems like people were not thrilled. They had a lot to say about it. It is effectively what Radha said, where a huge portion of the federal workforce, there's about 2 million federal workers, a little bit over, about 50,000 of them are estimated to be in the category of those who will be converted to scheduled policy career, which means that they are in policy influencing roles. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, but it's not a political appointee. We have those are separate. Those are appointed by the White House. These are folks who are hired under competitive service rules. They are hired as career officials by agencies, but because of the role that they are in, which is meant to be higher impact or more impactful on the president's policymaking agenda, they are moved to at-will employment. And some of the rationale around this is that a belief that the current civil service system, it makes it so hard to remove poor performers that those poor performers who have a significant impact on the president's policy agenda, the president should have authority and control of whether or not he can remove them in any way. This is the theory. I'm not saying I believe this. So this goes into place in a month. And in that time period between when they put up the rule out and when it goes into effect, agencies are supposed to be scrubbing the whole list of employees they have to see who is actually in this policy influencing category. Is it the entire agency? Is it like 2 people at the agency? Who falls in those categories? And then they come back, they send it to OPM, OPM sends it to the president, and the president approves it. And then you're in scheduled policy career with no ability to appeal whether or not you're in the right category or not.
But you, just to continue on nerd, and then I want to talk about kind of whether this actually makes sense. But you mentioned that it's not exactly Schedule F, but it sounds like kind of a lot like Schedule F, if I remember my Trump administration one right. So can you kind of tie the thread? How does this relate to the 2020 executive order, and how did what we got kind of here in 2026?
Yeah. So some of it is the fact that the Trump administration, in the meantime, did their legal homework. They're trying to do a lot with this rule, and in particular, they're trying to protect it from being challenged by the courts. And by the courts, so it's definitely going to be challenged by the courts, but they wanted to prevent it from being successfully challenged, which means that they have gotten more specific in terms of what they believe to be policy influencing. That's actually still, I think, in my view, is kind of a broader category, but they've added more definition here. They have changed who makes the ultimate call and decision, which is the president, not OPM, which is fascinating, and which is kind of harkens back to the president's executive authority. They have also changed the fact that you are hired under the new policy. You are hired as a career civil servant, and you can be appointed to a position that has all the protections that a career civil servant gets, but only after 2 years. So let me give you an example of that. If I applied to a Schedule PC position, I got the position. In 2 years, I gain competitive service protections for myself, not for my role. So I could transfer into another role and not have lost those protections. If I stay in my Schedule PC role, then I can be fired at will. Similarly, somebody who is like named into one in the next month or so, they are become an at-will employee, but if they transfer over to another role, they can retain those competitive service protections. So that's both it's not just even new, it's just they just hadn't kind of built out, like, how would we actually implement this? So they both did some additional legal homework to give themselves some more legal infrastructure around them, but then also built out more, how would this actually work in practice?
Okay, so you said policy influencing, and like, help me, and I mean, I guess I have a good sense from working various government roles, but like, help us understand, what does that actually mean in terms of, are we talking about senior people? Are we talking about, people editing memos? Like, what does this look like? And what is a policy influencing role? What does that even mean?
So one key word in that phrase is role, not person. So the role itself is what the agencies are looking at. They're not just thinking, oh, Radha is policy influencing. They're thinking that the role that you are in and the role that will always be there, even after you leave, will be policy influencing. So that's meant to conclude roles that shape or interpret regulations or policy or write them, that advise senior leaders on policy choices, that translate presidential priorities into action, that direct the work of people doing this stuff. Or that sit in policy offices or regulatory offices and have authority to influence how those are carried out. So that is, as you're probably hearing from my voice, a lot. That's a whole lot of possibilities in my mind of who they might be in there, but it's not meant to include, there's some kind of more technical roles that it's not meant to include, like scientists, or people who are program implementers on the front lines, or people who are customer service agents, who arguably have some influence in terms of how policy is impacted and carried out every day, but like, that's not like why they get up in the morning. They're more executors. What they're not supposed to be considering is things like performance or seniority or political beliefs or individual behavior. But almost all of these are still fairly subjective. Like, one person's policy influencing might be just another person's, like, I'm just sitting here running the calculator every day. So I think it's going to be pretty challenging. It's going to be pretty challenging for agencies to come up with a list internally. It's going to be very challenging for those lists across agencies to be somewhat comparable and to make sure that you are making decisions that are, to the degree they can be fair across the entire federal workforce.
Thinking about that scope of folks that are impacted, what does this change about both their jobs and about kind of the role of civil servants and how they can do their jobs? Like, why do we care about whether civil servants have these protections or not?
Yeah. So right now, if you are a civil servant, it's like a GS-13 working on arms control policy, you can't be arbitrarily fired because of your political beliefs, or because of somebody doesn't like you or somebody disagrees with you, which means that you, in theory, have the ability to be more direct, more open, more honest about the policy advice that you offer, the analysis you put forward, and whether or not you have any fear of whether or not it's going to be rejected, because you are protected in your role from what are called prohibited personnel practices. In addition to that, so when you change into Schedule PC, while you're not supposed to fire people based on any of the prohibited personnel practices, you no longer have appeal rights. So that means outside of the agency, you don't have the ability to go to the Merit System Protection Board and say, hey, I was just fired and I believe it was because I was discriminated against. You don't have the ability to do a whistleblower report about whether or not you believe you were fired due to things that are against prohibited personnel practices or whistleblower reprisal. Instead, what's going to happen now is that agencies are supposed to come up with their own systems of when it is appropriate or inappropriate to be letting somebody go who is in Schedule PC. So that puts a huge burden on agencies who are not set up to do that right now, and also raises the specter of like a whole bunch of inconsistency just based on personalities and across agencies. So I think what day-to-day it changes is, how safe do you feel being able to do the work of the people that you are called on to do every day and offer advice, to make do analysis, to make recommendations, to work on sensitive policy portfolios? And if you don't feel safe, are you going to leave that role and leave it open for somebody else who maybe is not as expert as you? On top of that, if you get caught in the crosshairs for whatever reason, for good or bad, you then have no ability, there's no adjudicative process to make sure that your removal is appropriate. Whereas now, even if you did something egregious, you still have an adjudicative process that would evaluate whether or not would let you appeal that if allowed, or would allow others to evaluate whether or not they had followed the process in getting rid of you. Now it's just kind of would be subject to agencies and whatever they felt like.
I hear you on the point of, look, it's, you want people to be able to speak out, and you want people to feel safe enough to share their views, especially on these policy influencing roles, because you have experts in the government. Mm-hmm. The flip side is, obviously, the administration is arguing you have poor performers and the protections are so rigid in place now that you can't remove them. And obviously this is an effort, at least framed as an effort, to fix that. So do they have a point? Is that a problem? Does this fix it? What is there a trade-off here?
They definitely have a point that the current performance management system is both not well understood, managed, or utilized. They also have had the opportunity, if they had wanted to make changes to that. As an example, the Department of Treasury at the IRS used to have a list of what they call, or maybe still has a list of what they call, like the 10 deadly sins. If you do any of these things when you're at the IRS, you're not allowed to work there. You're fired. That doesn't exist in the same way for federal employees writ large. There's things that could be done in order to make the system both clearer and easier to understand, and make managers less afraid of going down the path of taking somebody through a performance process. Right now, there's so many layers to it and so much risk associated with it that most managers are like, I both don't understand and I'm scared of how to do it based on all of the input that I'm giving. You could create resources for managers. You could be clear about the sorts of expectations that people were meant to follow. And you could also go to Congress and say, we want some help to actually change the civil service system. Instead, they created this rule that effectively upends 140-year history of how we think of civil servants in these merit system protected roles. So I think they have a fair point of like, yeah, the system is not great, but managing by fear is also really not great. And we know that for a whole lot of reasons. Getting rid of one of the true assets that we have, America as a global power, this like merit-based nonpartisan civil service with the ability to work on national security issues across parties, that's a huge impact on American power and institutions. And then lastly, this is going to spend the next couple of years, if not more, tied up in the courts and create a ton of confusion in whether or not it actually works and can get implemented.
So with all of that complexity, I'll call it, kind of wrapping this portion up, what should we be watching for over time, both in the near term and in the medium term?
So I think, as I hinted at this, first, I would really want Congress and others to be paying attention to consistency across agencies. Like, is 100% of an agency being put on Schedule PC, which the former head of the Social Security Agency, Social Security Administration, said that's what they were going to do. I don't think that's what they're planning to in this case, but that was one of the original intents. The second thing I'd be looking at is whether or not agencies deal with the fact that there's no appeal rights for this. So if you're put in Schedule PC and you don't believe that you should be there, you don't have the ability to challenge that at the moment. I expect that agencies are going to have problems with that, and they're ultimately going to end up having to change. I would want Congress and others to pay attention to, look, if the administration is to be taken seriously, we should see federal performance skyrocket and have it be significantly increasing over time. And then finally, last thing I would look at is, while Schedule PC hiring processes are meant to be the same as regular career hiring processes, I would want to watch that in practice and see if this administration in particular is using this in a way to put in political appointees into career protected roles over time.
Okay, well, that's a lot of things to watch out for.
That's not a problem. Can we talk about Munich for a few minutes? Because, all right, so we have like serious things to talk about Munich, but also like I have some thoughts about the whole like AOC, Rubio, and other kinds of debate too. So let's talk seriously, but also I want to bring in some of the gossip.
Munich obviously just wrapped, and there are a bunch of different things swirling around. There's America's, I'll call it conditional commitment, its new approach to commitment. However, it's the situationship with Europe, the Europeans' own lack of defense capabilities or desire for future defense capabilities. And of course, Ukraine, which I'll just note is literally still at war. There was a great horrifying piece in the New York Times about kind of what they're trying to do on electricity in the winter to keep the lights and heat on. And so, that is still ongoing. And while everyone but Ukraine talks about peace in Ukraine, I think there's a real pressure campaign to get them to agree to something. So maybe we can just start off by talking about what is going on with the U.S. pieces.
Marco Rubio, it was just really kind of gross watching the whole Marco Rubio slithering through Munich parade for a number of reasons. One, he acted really nice while using lots of language around like, we are the children of Europe, our fates are intertwined, and civilizational things, where what was actually happening is he was saying like, hey, Europeans, you need to like dump all your DEI policies and climate stuff and close your borders. And if you don't, then we're going to be really mad at you and we won't be friends anymore. And what was grossest to me about that is that Europe was just frankly so happy not to be kicked in the face that they applauded him. So my reaction was like, wait, are you guys listening to the words coming out of his mouth? Or are you just happy to have him be screaming at you? And I kind of feel like it's a little mixed there. Like there's some curiosity.
I mean, I don't only half jokingly call it a situationship, because I really feel like it's just like America's just being a really bad potential future boyfriend right now, in which they, say if they nag you, they tell you they don't like your clothes, they don't call, they won't show up, but then they're just so excited when they call last minute to take you out on a date, and you're like, is this really what we should be doing here? So it definitely, what came across crystal clear was that some combination of the culture wars and trade wars are what's driving America's priorities. And I mean, Rubio mentioned Ukraine, I think, one time maximum in his speech. And so clearly stopping Russia from redrawing the European map is not top of their list.
He didn't mention Russia at all, which is just like going to Munich, the Munich Security Conference, which is like this strange ritual we do every year, and not saying the words Russia as the United States, just wow, we are in the upside down. I'm watching Stranger Things right now. We are fully in the upside down. But with that, then Europe gets to react with like, oh, okay. So like first we felt kind of comforted by this, but maybe actually we are not, and we should be more freaked out, and we need to the European Commission president said that it's time to bring mutual defense clause to life, which like, hey, that's been around for like 15, 16, 17 years. Maybe if it's not brought to life yet, maybe it's just dead. Maybe it's just dead on the table. Like, so I appreciate the continued inching of the European experiment towards actually wanting to care about their own mutual security in some way. But I feel as though they've had a number of different wake-up calls, and the wake-up call is just like ringing incessantly, and they just continue to hit the snooze button.
I mean, just to put a fine point on it, look, they just don't have the military industrial capacity. And if Russia literally invading Ukraine the EU can't even get it together to figure out what the deployment force looks like as Russia is like scaled up its industrial capacity and is routinely shelling another European country, namely Ukraine. Like, it's hard to know what to do with that. The mutual defense clause, not to mention the fact that obviously the U.S. interests and the role of NATO then gets very much thrown into question should that pact be realized.
Right. So I have a few different views on this. Like, one, yeah, like listening / watching her speech is awkward. It's not polished foreign policy Munich professional. It is not the kind of harken back to 15 years ago, 20 years ago, seeing John McCain or Lindsey Graham or Chris Murphy or others do some of their speeches there. It is not that. I had a couple of reactions to it that I don't know if they were rational. One is that the media just sorts of glides over the president of the United States, sounding like an absolute, like, insane person all the time, and still sorts of, and tries to like wash his remarks, effectively making them clear, as clear as they can. Whereas with AOC, didn't do that, and in fact, like, kind of minutely pointed out where she stumbled both in sort of in voice, but also just in message. So I was frustrated by that, but I also kind of get like, okay, this was meant to be like her foray to the world stage. It was meant to be a polished performance, and it didn't get there. So like, fair. The second thing that really struck me though is like, I like listening to AOC quite a bit talk about policy issues where she is offering a lens that is very different than your average politician and can explain it in a way that makes sense, but from a very, very different angle than most are taking this on. And by setting her up to deliver fairly kind of trite talking points at Munich, I thought like that was a total misuse of her time, and would actually love to hear, if you could have it, a conversation with her around foreign policy that was more in her vibe. And she did this a bit, like she kind of talked about like, working class foreign policy, things like that. She got there, and which I thought was an interesting comparison to foreign policy for the middle class. But I don't love there's certain phrases we must all be able to say about U.S. foreign policy. And it's like the line on Taiwan and how we defend allies, blah, blah, blah. I don't love that anymore. Like, I wish we could be able to get beyond that and bring in AOC to say like, look, I don't know about any of that stuff, but here's what I know, and be able to have some kind of mutual conversation here. Anyway, she looked great. I'll say that too.
I was just going to say, so on the plus side, she said things like, she called out the authoritarianism bent of the current administration and really the risks of U.S. withdrawal in much more stark terms than we have heard from public American speakers, even Democrats, to date. And I think that was valuable. And she condemned things like the operation in Venezuela, the threats to Greenland, right? Like, all of those were great. I think, Lauren, to your point, what I do wish she had done was actually an alternative perspective. Like, to your point, like, look, I don't know if we need to be projecting into these places. I don't know if we need to do this and this, but what we do need is some actual international policy that relates to the American people, like her bread and butter. And it seemed like she basically hired someone else's speechwriter to write her foreign policy speech.
But Radha, she literally did.
I know. Well, fair.
It's so awkward here. Sorry. She did. Anyway.
Fair. And I think that showed. And, part of her vibe is that she is genuine and when she is not polished, it is not polished in the way that comes across as authentic. And here it was not polished, and it came across as unprepared. And I think that was an unfortunate turn of events for her.
Yeah. I would like, if she woke up in the morning 2 months ago and said, I have something genuine and purposeful to say on foreign policy, I would be super interested to hear what that is. I don't know that it makes sense to go put her in the mix of Munich Security Conference, because it's always going to be this weird bar against these kind of very nice smelling, nice looking European people who don't say a whole lot of things. And there's always a couple of Americans who talk about Europe needs to like pull its own weight, and then whatever weird thing the administration is going to say.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. I think Munich is always an interesting experience, I'll call it. And I want to wrap, on kind of just not forgetting that Ukraine, as I mentioned before, is still grinding through huge numbers of casualties, diminishing Western support. And it looks like this security architecture just isn't holding up. And so I think Munich was maybe in some senses, this is a transformation point for Munich itself on what the value of that kind of conference is in a world where it's, platitudes that don't even reassure or reaffirm anything. They just, maintain a situationship. And I guess we'll see what happens next.
I wish I could come up with another Mean Girls style analogy, but it was so good from the last time. Well, all right. Well, next up, we are welcoming an incredible guest to talk about AI policy in the U.S.
Okay. Well, with that, this week on Warning Signs, we get to talk about a fascinating story on how AI enthusiasm and the actual economic data that are intersecting with the combination of public attitudes and local issues to create a complex environment, shall we say. So on the surface, the U.S. economy has been growing at about 2%. The stock market's at all near highs. Obviously, President Trump has been talking about this a great deal, but underneath it, there's a huge consolidation of where that growth is coming from, largely from AI. And that's driven by a number of complicated things: data center construction, mass and range of issues like tariffs and manufacturing weakness. And it creates a whole cascade of consequences for the grid and for the environment, all of which is affecting public attitudes, consumer confidence, and a host of issues that could really impact both the current environment and future elections. So to talk us through some of this, we are delighted to welcome Rebecca Lissner, the Senior Fellow for U.S. Foreign Policy at the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome, Rebecca.
Thank you so much. It's great to be back with this crew.
I want to start us, anchor us. You had a recent piece in Time magazine that talked through some of the electoral issues that related to AI. And you noted in particular that Americans haven't really voted with AI as an electoral issue to date. And this might be the first election that has that. So we obviously have all this economic data showing AI data center construction is pushing and propping up GDP. How should we think about the kind of environment we're in right now, where we have this massive bet with really uncertain demand and this kind of economy being propped up by this sector? And in particular, how are we seeing that connected to maybe like broader political considerations?
Yeah, so I think it's a really interesting and probably a story that's not getting enough attention right now. So glad we're doing it in this segment. So as you mentioned, I published a piece in Time now a couple weeks ago titled "A Populist Backlash Over AI is Brewing in America," which I think captures this idea that we're really entering a new age of AI politics. And we've started to see it bubble up. We saw it shaping key races last year, whether that was the Georgia State Utility Commission, whether that was the Virginia and New Jersey gubernatorial races. But this year in the midterms, I expect that AI will start to be an increasingly important part of our economic debates about affordability, about employment and unemployment. And by 2028, when we're in the midst of the next presidential election cycle, I think that AI is going to become a top tier voting issue. And this is new. We have not had a national debate about AI before. It's a brand new issue. There's a lot of uncertainty about the future. And part of what's interesting is that neither political party has yet found their footing on AI. So we see this large demand from the public when you look at public opinion polling for more regulation. That's not what's coming out of the White House right now. But there's also not really a coordinated platform that either party is putting forward about what it would look like to do some combination of regulation, social policy, national security policy around AI. And so what I try to put forward is a thumbnail sketch of what that agenda could look like in such a way that we can start to meet the American people where they are, which is in a place of significant anxiety and concern about what the future is going to look like when the rate of change as it relates to AI innovation, AI deployment just appears very concerning and very fast.
You mentioned some of the local and state elections. Obviously, there's also been a lot of conversation, for instance, about electricity prices and also, I think underlying that is some of the question on who's bearing the cost of that, whether it's companies or consumers. So how does I'll call it economic reality, job uncertainty, increased prices, in particular things like energy, how does that start to reshape in your mind some of the politics of this AI policy on who and where politicians are going to face challenges or face concerns about what they're doing on AI?
Well, first of all, to the reality you're describing, it's super interesting. So at the end of last year, I did a project here at the Council on Foreign Relations where we convened more than 300 Americans outside of the Beltway to talk about the future of America's role in the world. So I traveled to Detroit, to Phoenix, to Atlanta. We convened a number of virtual sessions. I met with small business owners, with labor leaders, with faith leaders, with state and local elected officials, a really broad swath of people. And I asked them about foreign policy, but what I found they were most interested to talk about in many cases was actually AI. And this came through very strongly, in particular in Georgia, but other places as well, where average people, I'm thinking here about Gen Z college students who I talked to at places like Georgia State, Wayne State, Arizona State. And I asked them, what do you think about the future of AI? And they started talking about utility prices. They said, my grandma can't run her dishwasher between the hours of 7 and 10 in the evening because the price of water and electricity is so high. And whether or not that kind of story is specifically true, it speaks to something I heard over and over again, which is this idea that average Americans are bearing the costs, the utility costs in particular, of the AI build out and of the data centers that they see in their communities. And so there was this general sense that, yes, local elected officials were creating a lot of incentives for data centers to be built in specific communities. This came up a lot in Arizona, but that the communities themselves were not necessarily seeing the benefits. Maybe you get a short-term surge in construction jobs, but the view was then average people are bearing the cost of the utility increases, water, electricity. Average people are having to look at these data centers. Average people are dealing with the pollution and environmental costs. Average people are also then having to deal with the noise. And so the sentiments I heard were overwhelmingly negative, and I think are borne out by the data, where we see that in many cases, in the absence of government intervention and regulation, average Americans are paying more for their electricity and bearing a disproportionate share of the cost associated with the requirements of data centers. And we know, a normal data center can consume as much electricity as 100,000 households, and that's not even one of the biggest ones. So this reality is already starting to reshape politics at the local level, and we've seen these local coalitions that have emerged, and they're bipartisan. It's not just led by NIMBY Democrats. It's not just led by MAGA Republicans. You actually see in local communities, Democrats, Republicans, independents organizing together to try to block data centers, not everywhere, but in some places. And we see this on the national level too, where two of the biggest opponents of data centers are actually Senator Bernie Sanders and Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. So this speaks to the mobilizing force of this trend that we're starting to see, and the reality that there's probably much more political disruption to come.
So I want to build on this point just a little bit before we move on to the next topic of the distance between what you see in the DC policymaking fights versus the conflicts that we're seeing in states. And in particular, what you think what do you think like is between that gap right there? Like, what is it that DC policymakers are missing about this increased unease? And if that doesn't change, do you see like what kind of potential upcoming tensions or conflicts do you see coming up, particularly as it relates to the 2026 midterms, but also just going into the future?
I think the big thing, Lauren, it just has to do with how much the China arguments are going to carry the debate. And here in DC, so much of the framing, at least amongst foreign policy people like us, around AI has to do with the AI race between the US and China and who's going to get to AGI first, or who's going to come out ahead. What does the race even mean? And I think there's been an assumption that the American people will allow policymakers to kind of do what it takes in order to achieve these national objectives for AI. We saw this with the Trump administration's AI action plan, where the subtitle is Winning the Race. And that has informed a very laissez-faire, very light regulation approach to trying to just run really fast. When they talk about data centers in the AI action plan, they say their idea is build, baby, build, right? And that may be, strictly speaking, what is required to outcompete China when it comes to the AI race, if that's the right framing for it. But it's going to become increasingly difficult when you have a grandmother who's struggling to pay their electricity bills, when you have a middle-class corporate worker who's lost their customer service job because of increased AI-related automation and job loss, to tell them, well, you really need to eat that because we're trying to run faster than China and develop AI more quickly than China. And so we need to come up with a more compelling political argument than just pointing to China in order to be able to do the kind of innovation that we actually do need to do, because I don't want to discount how important it is geopolitically for the United States to continue to lead on AI, but we can't take public support for that objective for granted. And it may require some recalibration across a number of types of policies when it comes to regulation, when it comes to social policy, the types of social policy solutions we might consider to help people who are affected by AI-related job loss. And frankly, when it also comes to chip export controls, which is something that a lot of inside the Beltway experts do spend a lot of time thinking about, but it may actually be that by controlling the export of the most advanced AI chips to China, we can buy ourselves a bit more time to get some of those regulatory and social policy questions right, rather than having to or feeling like we have to race as fast as we can with the Chinese nipping at our heels.
I thought you made this really good point that like framing this around China, a race with China, is the wrong framing. Not only because it's the wrong framing for the moment, but also as I was reading this, I thought like how like kind of insultingly simplistic is this framing of like, oh, for China reasons as opposed to any number of other reasons. So I guess my question though is like, then how do you be persuasive to those who have built their careers, who are building their strategies purely in a race with China perspective? You started to get to some of the reasons why it may actually be more sustainable for the United States, full stop. But how do you be persuasive to those who have built their entire arguments around this compete with China perspective?
Well, I think it just comes down to the question of whether on current course with present narrative, the Trump administration or others who align themselves with those goals can actually achieve what they want to achieve. And so if you assume that there's some low-level public opposition, but it doesn't matter very much, maybe the answer is yes. But what I think we're seeing is a canary in the coal mine when it comes to this increasing populist grievance, when it comes to, in the first instance, data centers, but more broadly, AI. And my expectation is that the amount of disruption that's going to come from widespread AI deployment, from the changes that we're already starting to see over the next few years, is going to create a lot of political upside in just being anti-AI. Because it's going to be a while before we have the kind of solutions to create a new social or political or economic compact that can actually reckon with the degree of change that seems to be coming. And so I believe that if you really care about geopolitical competition with China as it relates to AI, you need to start thinking about the domestic side of this so as to retain the space to make the policies that you think are important from that geopolitical perspective. So we just can't do the geopolitics in isolation. We have to factor in the domestic politics. And frankly, the analogy that I've been mulling over recently has to do with the era of free trade and globalization, where it was true that on net, free trade, globalization, the sort of WTO heyday era generated net increases in GDP that benefited a lot of Americans, but it also created a lot of pain for specific Americans in ways that were not just politically consequential, but also affected the way that policy was conducted going forward. And so even if the more optimistic projections are true about the kinds of productivity gains that we're likely to see in aggregate as a result of AI and what that can mean for the labor market, the near-term disruptions that will entail for individual people, for middle-class workers who are then going to be told, you might consider becoming a plumber or a home health worker, because those are actually the skills that are more needed now as we're able to replace jobs like yours with AI. I think that's going to face a lot of the same challenges that came with job retraining and attempts to steer manufacturing workers in different directions. And so my expectation is just that the upheaval is going to be quite significant in the short to medium term, and that is going to create dynamics that could be distortive of the policies that many experts might otherwise find to be optimal.
I think the free trade analogy is such a good one because we're obviously living in so much of the political aftermath of that. And I think it's unambiguous that it generated economic growth net, but that net growth is not what people see in their pocketbooks when they have to, pay higher prices for eggs and they don't have long-term jobs. So you make this point that we need a new political vocabulary for AI policy that actually, as you said in the beginning of this, meets Americans where they are, takes real some of the anxieties they're experiencing. What does that political vocabulary sound like? What should we be talking about, and how do we start thinking about that in the common political context?
Well, I think it's going to be iterative, and it will be very interesting to see how different political leaders attempt different messaging strategies. I don't think we know enough about where the public is to exactly know what will work. There is some public opinion polling out there, but not very much. I personally haven't seen much focus group data or message testing. So I think this is the work that is coming as everyone will try to figure out what is the winning political message. But to me, it starts with acknowledging the anxiety and not papering over it, right? Like, we have to acknowledge that this is a time when many Americans, young Americans, older Americans, feel deeply uncertain about what their future will look like. They acknowledge that there could be some significant benefits when it comes to AI and how it could change their lives. But in many ways, they're more concerned about the downsides. And so acknowledging that anxiety, acknowledging the loss where it exists, job loss, acknowledging the disparity between the way that companies are making a lot of money off of the AI boom, which is where we started, and the way that average people aren't feeling that. I start there. From there, we can then talk about, so here's how we're going to actually deal with this coming AI disruption. And if you look at the public opinion polling there, people don't want to just stop innovation in its tracks. They don't want a zero regulation environment, but they also don't want a zero innovation environment. And so I see the public as wanting to hear about a balanced approach, an approach that I would argue, unlike the one we've seen from the Trump administration, really elevates the public interest over corporate interest, but also acknowledges that there is a national interest in the U.S. being an AI leader, and a lot of that innovation is coming from the private sector. So to me, the agenda is, number one, regulation. It should cover data center construction. It should cover privacy protections, trust and safety standards, legal liability frameworks. And in all cases, basically, the aim is to ensure that AI is developed safely and securely, that companies are held accountable when they create harm or behave in negligent ways, but also maintaining space for innovation to continue, but real regulation in the kind that we haven't seen yet. I think the second plank is social policy. And this is a place where I think we're really going to have to push, because it's uncomfortable to think about government programs to support people who are impacted by AI development. We know that in the context of the trade debates in the 1990s, we never really succeeded in trying to do the sort of trade adjustment assistance that we knew was going to be necessary to help people who were affected by free trade. It could include price stabilization in electricity markets along the lines of some things that we're starting to see discussed now. But it's going to require much more active intervention, I think, by the government to try to smooth out the disruption that many Americans are experiencing. And then the third, as we discussed, is national security policies that give us more space by restricting China's access to sophisticated AI chips so that we have the time to do some of this iteration, to do some of this policy work and manage these AI-related disruptions without ceding leadership to Beijing. And then, a last piece of this that I didn't put in the article, but that I've been thinking about recently is also the international governance piece, because some of the AI harms that will affect Americans don't just emanate from within the United States and aren't just at the hands of American companies. And so we really do need to start thinking about what some kinds of international standards and governance frameworks could look like in a way that protects Americans from AI-related harms that start elsewhere but could still come across our borders. So none of that is a bumper sticker tagline that I think anyone can take to the campaign rally tomorrow, but I hope it sort of gestures in the direction of where we should be going, both as a matter of sort of tone and public messaging, but also as a matter of policy and convincing the American people that people like us are serious, do understand what their anxieties are, and have a plan for how we can manage them.
One last question before we wrap up. Particularly as you were walking through this last section, I was thinking about a related but different sort of policy challenge faced by the U.S. government in implementing the CHIPS Act and all of the new bureaucratic infrastructure, thinking, and talent that was necessary in order to do all of that, and all the lessons, frankly, that we've taken from it. But as you're thinking about your three policy planks, I wonder, if somebody's served in government in a few different roles, have you had any thoughts around what may be new or different around how government needs to organize around AI in the future, whether it comes to structures, institutions, policy conversations, talent, any of the above that we might need to adapt to as we think about your future policy planks here?
It's such an interesting and hard question. And I could say even on the outside where the demands are fewer, I don't find that this conversation is as integrated as I would hope it would be across all the different people who are thinking about the different pieces of that. So I do think we have work to do right now in bringing together all the threads of this conversation so that we can be doing idea generation together. Because part of the point I'm trying to make is you can't make national security policy in isolation, but you also can't make regulation in isolation from the others and so on. And so we need to look at the whole picture together. I like, Loren, the way that the Trump administration has centralized AI policy, at least sort of in an org chart sense, in an AI czar kind of position. That's something that was appealing to me in the past as well. And so I do think having that kind of coordination mechanism where you can bring together, even just thinking about the White House, the National Security Council piece of this, the National Economic Council piece of this, the Domestic Policy Council piece of this, the OSTP piece of this. I mean, everyone's going to be working on some element of the AI picture, and we are going to have to bring all the pieces together. But then, who's going to execute the policy? Where's the money going to come from? How are you going to design this actual kind of whole of government approach? And Loren, it's even more complicated than that, because also what are you going to do about state level regulation? And how do you think about the relationship between state and federal regulation? What's the Congress going to do? So I don't mean to say that any of this is going to be easy, but those are exactly the questions we need to start asking ourselves, at the same time as we're thinking about how do you design a society or an economy that is adaptive to the changes that come with AI. We also need to be asking ourselves that about the government from a policymaking perspective, in addition to all the other ways that you two have spent much more time than I have in sort of thinking about the actual AI adoption questions when it comes to the federal government.
Well, Rebecca, thank you. We covered a lot of ground and a really important topic that I'm sure we will cover again, but we really appreciate you joining us to walk us through some of these pieces.
Thank you for having me.
Last up in Gong Show, by the time you listen to this, the Olympics may be over, but the Olympics are still going on right now. So I really just wanted to spend a minute on what impressions, good or bad, what takeaways, what fun moments have you had from the Olympics? And I will start with mine, because I haven't really watched very much, just full disclosure here. But I did watch the opening ceremonies, and I had some serious questions about the footwear of the people who were introducing all of the countries and the weird sort of microwave blanket things that they were wearing, and also the fact that they were using these blocks of ice that had the names of the countries on them. I found all that to be strange and disturbing. I liked some of the fashion, but the one I'm going to comment on that I have felt most strongly about is, I believe it was the Czechs. And if I'm wrong, Czechs, I apologize, for wearing shorts over leggings, because that fashion style went out to the degree that it was in the 90s. So while the 90s are back in some ways, we are not bringing that back. You need to do something. Fire your fashion guy.
I don't know. Dress over jeans are next. Dress over jeans. So I have long shared the view that many people say of the value of having like a regular person do Olympic activities to show you how insanely hard it is. And on NBC, they had, for reasons that I really can't say because I've just seen like little clips of it, Colin Jost do the bobsled.
Yep. Oh, yeah.
And it's just great. He's like, I've never thought I was going to die so much. And it felt like my body was going to like fall off. Like I was just like, all right. So I think, in general, I would love to see the Saturday Night Live Olympics crossovers of like, who do we push down the downhill slope and just see how fast they go? Like, who do we send out to try to do twirls on ice skating? I feel like the amusement is endless. And this is where I have spent my time.
I think there's a lot of possibilities there. I would also appreciate an explainer of like how some Olympic sports came to be with maybe some demonstrations, like the skeleton, the two-man skeleton, which is just like literally two men laying on top of each other on a sled. Like, why? Like, how is that better or harder? Like, that just strikes me as superfluous.
I mean, it definitely makes me think that in cold countries, people were like, we should just do this because even if we die, it'll be more interesting than being stuck inside for another day.
That's true. That's true. All right. Well, you have concluded another successful episode of Sirens. If you haven't loved us on the social medias or on your podcast platform of choice, please do so. And we'll see you next time.
Thank you.